Well, hello and welcome to another episode exploring the course of the River Tweed from its source to its estuary. In this particular episode, we will visit the iconic border town of Peebles, following the river through this historic and picturesque town. And as you can see, the town is there behind me on the other side of the river, and I am here on a winter's afternoon at the end of 2024 in my winter garb with me hat on. It is -7 at the moment. The sun is shining though, and therefore a good day for filming. Anyway, let's get on with this particular episode, which is packed with history and unusual things to see. From Needpath Castle, where we finished the last episode, the river twists through the gorge and opens out into a shallow valley. This is where the east end of the Needpath railway tunnel opens out. The tunnel is sealed off, but the entrance to the tunnel can be reached on foot, though not very easily. You will remember we saw the west entrance of the tunnel as it opened out onto the Needpath viaduct that we saw in the last episode. Just below the cemetery is Haylodge Park, and here a footbridge built in 1953 called Fotheringham Bridge crosses the river. The river is now in full flow, some 15 to 20 metres wide. The Tweed flows right through the centre of the town of Peebles, separating the original old town on its north bank from the relatively new area of the town on its south bank. Within a mile from Needpath Castle, we reach the centre of Peebles, and here the Tweed is joined by Eddleston Water. This tributary begins about 15 miles north near Penicuik on the outskirts of Edinburgh. Immediately after the confluence of the Eddleston with the Tweed is a weir built across the river. A weir in Scotland is known as a cauld. This particular cauldre was built to divert the river into the channels that turned the water wheels that powered the Tweedside woolen mill. Nowadays, its only purpose is to provide a salmon leap for the migrating salmon heading up the river. A legacy left by the mill is the island that has formed downstream from the weir. Immediately after the cauldre is a very significant bridge called Tweed Bridge, not to be confused with the Royal Tweed Bridge in Berwick. From the earliest settlements in the upper Tweed Valley, the main method of crossing the Tweed was by fording across a shallow part of the river. Long before Peebles became a mill town, it was an important market town, with drovers bringing cattle from the Highlands on their way to do trade in England and other border towns. Therefore, a bridge was necessary. It's not clear when the first bridge was built. Almost certainly there would have been some sort of river crossing here from the early origins of the town. Back then, the Tweed was a lot narrower and shallower than it is today. So it was probably possible to cross the river with a rudimentary structure similar to tar steps in Somerset. That's purely conjecture on my part though. What we know for certain is that a wooden bridge existed at this spot during the 12th century, around the time King David I made Peebles a royal borough. Around 1460, the wooden bridge was replaced with a narrow stone arch bridge, 2.4 metres wide, just wide enough for a horse and cart. Further downriver, we will discover in a forthcoming episode that a bridge at Roxburgh was destroyed in the 1540s during the 8 years of conflict with England, known as Rough Wooing. That meant that this bridge in Peebles was the only bridge across the Tweed in its entire length until 1754, when the bridge at Kelso was built. And I will explain more on that later in the series. The bridge here was rebuilt in 1633 using stone from St Andrew's Parish Kirk, also destroyed during this period of rough wooing. And I will talk more on that shortly when we visit the kirk. By 1799, the Tweed had increased in width and it was necessary to alter the bridge. John Hislop of Peebles added 3 extra arches to the south end of the bridge. But in 1855 they were removed to make way for the Peebles railway line that linked Peebles with Broughton and Symington. All of this time the bridge remained 1 cart's width, around 2.4 metres. In 1834 it was widened to 6.4 metres, which was 2 lanes, and that was by adding stonework to both sides. The work was carried out by John and Thomas Smith of Melrose. The cost was £1,000, raised by public subscription. From 1897 to 1900, the bridge was widened again, this time to 12 metres wide, by adding to the downstream side of the bridge. This work was carried out by McTaggart and Cowan and cost £8,000, this time funded by the town council. Looking at the underside of these arches, you can see the various alterations. In 1971, the bridge was declared a Category A listed building. Such is its importance not only to the town, but the history of Scotland. I understand that there are new plans being drawn up for a new bridge crossing the river, though I'm unaware of what the details of that structure will be. So if anyone watching knows and has access to more information on that, please add it in the comments below the video. We will come back to the river later, but for this next section we need to look at this picturesque town in closer detail. The name of Peebles is thought to come from an ancient form of the Gaelic language known as Cumbric. The ancient Celtic tribe that lived here and spoke that language was the Selgovi tribe, and they called this location Peeble, meaning a settlement of tents. As you can see from this image, the dwellings were a little more substantial than just tents, more like hide-covered roundhouses. Anyway, that is thought to be where the town's name came from. The logical place to start this closer look at Peebles is the cemetery, and that is because as you enter Peebles along the course of the Tweed from the west, this is the first historic site you come across. It also ties in with what I just told you about where the extra stone came from for the bridge widening. This tower is all that remains of St Andrew's Kirk. So why was it ruined and subsequently demolished? Well, as I said before, it goes back to a period of unrest between Scotland and England, and of course there have been many such periods over the centuries. This particular conflict took place between 1543 and 1551, towards the end of Henry VIII's reign. It was also known as the 8 Years' War, or the period of rough wooing. The unrest began when Henry VIII had turned his back on the Catholic Church. The Pope would not grant him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. The Catholic faith was the Christian Church in England up to that point, but along with Anne Boleyn's influence, his second wife, Henry put himself at the head of a new Protestant Church of England as God's representative on earth. The Scottish had tried to rebel against Henry's plans, and a battle took place at Solway Moss in 1542, which the Scots lost. In 1543, the peace treaty of Greenwich, signed by Henry, was designed to restore the peace. The Scots had agreed to end the old alliance with France and give over the 1-week-old daughter of Mary of Guise, Mary Queen of Scots, to marry Henry's only son Edward, who was only 6 at that time. This was intended to unite England and Scotland for the first time, but as we know, this would only be achieved in 1603 when James VI of Scotland became King of England. So when the Scots reneged on the treaty, Henry ordered an invasion of Scotland, telling his generals to raze everything to the ground and sack Edinburgh. A great deal of the borders area was affected during this period, suffering much destruction, as we will see throughout the rest of this series. The original Kirk of St Andrews was established around the mid-600s and then replaced in 1195 with the one destroyed by Henry's troops in 1548, leaving only this tower still standing. This kirk, situated in a neighbouring border town, still intact, gives you some idea of what St Andrews may have looked like before it was destroyed. A year later, in 1549, Henry's troops were back to burn another kirk in Peebles, this time Crosskirk. Apparently, when St Andrews was destroyed the previous year, services had continued at Crosskirk. Hence the reason the English returned to destroy it too. This church has a fascinating history, and it begins with a group of French Catholic friars known as Trinitarians. They established a church here in 1261. They discovered a grave on the site inscribed as belonging to St Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra, an ancient Greek city in Lycia around 300 AD. Today the city lies in Turkey. The remains of the body was found with a cross and other relics. Yes, this is the same St Nicholas that was the origin of Santa Claus, and he was buried here in Peebles. Not a myth or a fanciful story, but fact. Because written records did not exist in England before the monks at Lindisfarne started with their manuscripts, no record of how St Nicholas came to be buried in Scotland exists. The discovery of the grave was made in the presence of King Alexander III, and it was recorded that several miracles were witnessed around the time of the grave being discovered. The king instructed that a priory should be built here. Later in 1474, the priory was upgraded to a monastery, and a bell tower and cloisters were added. It was the Reformation of Scottish religion in 1560, led by John Knox, that brought the closure of the monastery and the dispersal of the monks. Crosskirk then became the parish church until 1784, when a new church was built. The new parish church was built on the site of Peebles Castle and stood until 1885, when it was replaced by the magnificent structure we see today, with its imposing Gothic tower built in 1887 by the architect William Young. The tower has 13 bells installed. They are fixed and do not swing. Instead, they are struck by hammers initiated by a keyboard and a single bell ringer. The castle that once sat here was built by King David I in the mid-1120s, and it sat on a small motte where Eddleston Water and the Tweed meet. It would have commanded a good position for controlling the river. It's thought that this castle may have been more than a fort than a castle, built with a timber palisade rather than surrounded by stone walls. An archaeological dig in 1977 revealed traces of 2 wooden buildings at the top of the motte with no trace of any stonework. In 1152, the year before his death, King David made Peebles into a royal borough. That gave Peebles special privileges and enabled it to run its own affairs through a council or maybe the local laird. Peebles' importance was further elevated when William I of Scotland decreed Peebles as a host to the Chief Court of Justice. The 1100s saw the birth of heraldic designs and coats of arms, which many noble families adopted. They were emblazoned on the battle flags and flags above their castles. After Peebles became a royal borough, it too got a coat of arms. The design shows 3 salmon on a red background with the Latin inscription Contra Nando Incrementum. Translated means there is growth swimming against the stream. This refers to the annual migration of salmon up the Tweed, swimming against the flow of the river to lay their eggs. The salmon facing one way and the other 2 in an opposing direction represents that for every salmon going upriver, 2 come back to the sea. In 1306, Edward I visited Peebles to appoint a new sheriff to govern the border area. This was after Simon Fraser of Needpath Castle, the former sheriff, pledged his allegiance first to William Wallace and then to Robert the Bruce. Something Edward would not tolerate. Fraser was executed as I described in the last episode. The castle in Peebles' demise is not recorded, but it is widely presumed that it was destroyed during the English raid of 1548, which seems the most likely scenario. If not, then it would have certainly been destroyed a century later when Oliver Cromwell occupied Peebles and attacked Needpath Castle. 2 other important churches in Peebles that still have congregations are St Peter's, built in 1836 by William Byrne, hosting the Catholic community, and St Andrew's Lecky, built in 1876 with its impressive 44.5 metre spire, hosting the Protestant community. The name Lecky is in respect to a long-serving and influential vicar here. In the late 1800s, when the population of Peebles eventually increased due to the Industrial Revolution and expansion of the woolen mills, several churches of all denominations sprang up all over the town. Most did not survive, excepting for one. It was built in 1871 as a free church. Eastgate Church served the community for several decades. By the 1990s, it was only being used as a community hall and then earmarked for closure in 1996. The Borders 1996 company was set up, and after raising £2.8 million, the church was bought and transformed by Edinburgh architect Richard Murphy into the Eastgate Theatre. It officially opened its doors to the public in March 2004, providing a theatre, cinema, exhibition space, as well as a thriving cafe. Another of Peebles' interesting buildings is the Tontine Hotel, or Tontine Hotel, however you wish to pronounce that. And that was built in 1808 by French prisoners of war from the Napoleonic conflicts. The word tontine, or tontine, originates from a Neapolitan banker in 1653 called Tonti. He thought of a scheme whereby investors bought shares in a fund and earned a dividend. When a member of the scheme died, the profits were shared amongst the survivors. This would be repeated until only one member was left, and they would become the sole owner of the fund. This hotel was funded in that same fashion, and the last member of the scheme here was Sir John Hay, becoming the sole owner. In 1922, he sold it to the Trust House Forte Group, and in 2012 it was bought by the owners of Barony Castle in Eddleston, 10 miles north of Peebles. Incidentally, that is where the great Polish map of Scotland is situated. You may or may not have heard of this, and as it is not on the banks of the Tweed, I don't want to go too deep into its background. But suffice it to say that Barony Castle was used to train Polish soldiers during World War II. One of these soldiers ended up buying the castle in 1968. Inspired by a similar 3D map of Belgium he had seen in the World Trade Fair in 1958, he arranged and supervised the construction of the relief map here in Scotland. Standing outside the Tontine Hotel is a gold-painted postbox commemorating the Olympic gold medal won by Peebles' own Scott Brash. He won that medal in 2012 for show jumping. It is a rare postbox too, as it is from the reign of Edward VII. The old part of Peebles is a collection of magnificent historic buildings, which you should really witness for yourself. I want to mention two significant ones. First, the Peebles Hydro Hotel. If you follow the course of the river towards Innerleithen, it sits high on the hillside just as you leave the town of Peebles. The original hotel was built in 1878 and designed by John Starforth, an architect who designed many buildings in the border region. It was owned by the hydropathic company to provide hydrotherapy and water cures for visitors. It was one of many built in the same period throughout Britain. In 1907, the hotel was rebuilt following a fire that had happened 2 years earlier. The hotel was used as a hospital during the First World War, offering 1,200 beds. Today, Peebles Hydro is a prestigious spa hotel offering luxury stays as well as weddings and special occasions. The second building to note is far older, built during the 1500s, but also remodelled several times throughout the centuries. The building is known as the Chambers Institution and highlights how important Peebles was in Scottish history. It began as a private residence for the Dean of Crosskirk, but was subsequently owned by several high-profile figures in Scotland, including Sir John Hay, the first Marquess of Tweedsdale in 1624, and then William Douglas, the first Duke of Queensberry in 1687. It remained with the Douglas family until 1781, when it became home to the Provost James Reed. A provost in Scotland is similar to a mayor in England. In 1857, it was sold to William Chambers, the publisher of the famous Chambers Dictionary. He remodelled the building into the arrangement seen today, known as Scottish baronial style. Chambers provided the facilities within the building and its courtyard for the social development of the town. In 1911, the complex of buildings became owned by the Borough Council and formed the council chambers until Tweedsdale District Council was established in 1975. The building today houses the town's museum, the local library, a gallery including portraits of William Chambers and his brother Robert. In the archway that provides access to the courtyard is the entrance to the John Buchan Museum, the author of the novel The 39 Steps, and became the first Baron Tweedsmuir. The museum has many artefacts relating to this famous 20th century author who spent much of his childhood here, and it's well worth a visit. In the adjacent courtyard is a dramatic wall-painted mural called the Peebles Mural Project, which was created to celebrate the late Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012. The side of the old bakehouse provides the canvas for this masterpiece, and the artist is Michael Jessing, who lives and works locally. The mural depicts the history and culture of Peebles and unusually reads right to left in its chronology. Peebles experienced periods of prosperity and poverty throughout its history, as I've highlighted already. From the time of the wars with England in the late 13th century, Peebles and the whole border region was affected by a new increasing lawlessness. Feuding families on both sides of the borders, known as the Border Reivers. I've spoken of the Reivers before in past programmes, but just a brief recap for any new viewers. The Reivers were not lone criminals as you might think. These were noble families, people with lands and titles who used this period of conflict of one sort or another to exploit the lack of law and order to suit their own ends. The crimes they committed were mostly the stealing of livestock, but the rivalry amongst the gangs and families often led to abduction, rape and murder. This wasn't necessarily Scotland versus England. Families of the same nationality often feuded with each other, all in pursuit of power, greed and wealth. After Henry VIII's army destroyed much of the border region in 1548, this lawlessness increased dramatically. It got so bad that in the May of 1585, King James VI of Scotland ordered everyone living in the border region to meet in Peebles and face a warning and a reprimand in an attempt to halt the crimes. After Cromwell's occupation of the town in 1650, Peebles began to slide into a decline. The benefits of the Industrial Revolution, which began in 1750, were slow to take effect in Scotland. Between 1741 and 1783, the council had to purchase food to keep the people from starving. It wasn't until the arrival of the railways in 1855 that Peebles once again began to prosper. That prosperity was brought by the woolen industry and the production of the famous tweed cloth. But before I talk about the mills though, I need to dispel a few myths. Because of films like Braveheart and Rob Roy, the myths that the Scottish men wore tweed and that bagpipes were invented in Scotland has been allowed to grow, and both of these statements are incorrect. Shortly we will visit a bagpipe maker here in Peebles, but more on that in a moment. Let me focus on the cloth first. The process of weaving wool on any sort of meaningful level began in the mid-1500s and was introduced here in the Borders at Galashiels, which we will visit in an imminent episode. The craft of weaving was mentioned in a government document in 1587, suggesting that craftsmen from the Netherlands and the Belgium area should be encouraged to come to the border region and employ local apprentices in the mills there. So if woven tweed cloth and kilts didn't arrive in Scotland until the late 1500s, what actually did the Scottish people wear? Well, it was a garment worn all over Northern Europe called a lania. This was a long, loose shirt-like tunic made of linen tied in the middle, which was one of the most accessible and cheap materials at that time. It was dyed yellow using horse urine and worn with a bray, which were baggy shorts. The name of the cloth, being the same name as the river, came about by accident in 1826. A neighbouring border town mill in Howick sent an invoice to a London cloth merchant requesting payment for an order of tweel. The merchant mistook this as a spelling mistake to mean tweed. Tweel is the Scots word for twill, which was the pattern of weave used in those mills. The merchant believed the word tweed was the brand name for this cloth, and they subsequently advertised it as such in London, and the name tweed stuck ever since. People had been spinning wool and making cloth at least as far back as 6000 BC, and maybe before that. But that was done individually by hand using animal bones as tools. It wasn't until the 1700s that anything resembling large-scale commercial production of woolen fabric existed. In Scotland, that was first pioneered in the Western Isles and formed a lucrative trade with the mainland. As I mentioned in episode 1, the sheep farmed in Scotland were predominantly Scots blackface. Their wool was coarse and hard wearing. The cloth made from this wool suited the peasant farmers, as they needed garments that were rugged and strong. During the early 1800s, the English aristocracy, who sought Scottish estates to indulge their hunting, shooting and fishing pastimes, needed garments suitable to keep them warm and dry. The demand for tweed would grow steadily over the following years to come, and also the demand for new designs and colours. The growth of the Victorian industrialist too accelerated the growth of the mills, now required in abundance to cope with the demand. The tweed woolen industry was born. Production of tweed cloth was not restricted to the banks of this river though. It flourished right across Scotland. Wherever there was a fast-flowing river to power the mills and a plentiful supply of sheep to provide the wool. The mills in the borders first appeared in Galashiels, Jedburgh and Selkirk, and only appeared in Peebles in the mid-1800s. The first woolen mill in Peebles was the Tweedside Mill. The mill was originally a corn mill built in 1215 near to the confluence of the Tweed and Eddleston Water, the site of the swimming baths today. Initially, Peebles did not have a railway line, and mill owners protested that they were at a disadvantage to all the other mills in the neighbouring border towns. So the first railway line was installed in 1855 and initially linked Peebles with Edinburgh. There was a station on the junction of March Street and Edinburgh Road. As the woolen industry expanded, this station was closed in 1864 and a new station built a few hundred metres to the south in the area of Dean Park, and this was to allow an extension to be built to Galashiels. The line stayed open to passengers and freight until 1964, when it fell to Lord Beeching's sword in his extensive closures of the British rail network. The second line was an extension of the Symington to Broughton line and reached Peebles in 1864. The station was on the south bank of the river, near to where the fire station is situated today. This was the same line that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that used the Needpath Tunnel and Viaduct and was later linked to the privately run Tala line when the dam was under construction in 1895. This station was closed to passengers in 1950. Once the railways were established, further woolen mills in addition to Tweedside Mill were built, and they all prospered, namely Damdale Mill, owned by Walter Thorburn and Brothers, and March Street Mill, owned by David Ballantyne and Sons. The latter was the largest mill in Peebles, employing over 700 local workers, and only closed quite recently. The site of the old mill is earmarked for a new housing development. Tweed cloth is still manufactured in a handful of Scottish mills situated in the Spey Valley in the Highlands and the Isle of Lewis, but sadly no longer in Peebles. We're now going to meet one of the craftsmen living here in Peebles who makes bagpipes. But before we go off and meet him, let me just tell you about the origins of Scottish musical instruments. The very first musical instruments known to man were whistles made from animal bones. This one, found in Slovakia, is carbon dated at 60,000 years old. It may not have been used for playing music as we understand it today, but may have been used to signal danger or celebrate an event or call people to a gathering of some sort. Crude single-stringed instruments were found depicted in cave paintings in France, dated as 13,000 years old. Around 3000 BC, the first harps and lyres appeared in Egypt and the Middle East. The first harps came to Ireland around 1000 years ago, and into Scotland possibly around the same time, though not resembling the harps we see today. Bagpipes did not arrive in Scotland until the 1400s, though the exact date is uncertain. Some accounts say that the pipes were part of Scottish culture during the 13th century, but others say they arrived much later with the soldiers returning from the Crusades. Make of that what you will. Once the pipes were established in Scotland, they quickly became popular at large gatherings because of their ability to produce a sound loud enough to be heard at large gatherings. For the very same reason, the Scots used them to precede a battle, as their sound could be heard miles away as the Scottish armies marched to the battlefield, and therefore struck fear into the minds of the enemy. With that said, let's go and meet Julian at his workshop here in Peebles. Julian grew up in Edinburgh, but moved here to Peebles in 1990, and has always had a fascination for musical instruments and how they worked, but in particular the pipes. Julian and his brother John shared an interest in musical instruments, and in their youth they travelled much of Europe and the world, performing with mechanical street organs. Whilst abroad, Julian learned how to make his first pipe. His fascination with the pipes stems from childhood, and he has turned that fascination into a passion for making pipes. He makes pipes for people all over the world, mostly musicians, but also collectors and museums. The pipes currently being worked on are Cornish pipes. He has a commission to make 5 next year. The Northumbrian pipes, the Leicestershire pipes, and the Scottish small pipes. The wood used in the construction of the pipes are sourced locally around Peebles and includes woods such as walnut, cherry, plum and apple wood. Julian's customers always receive a photograph of the tree that the pipes were made from. Julian's other interest is mechanical street organs, and he owns 2 and plays them on fine weekends outside the Eastgate Theatre to raise funds for the theatre. Many thanks to Julian for allowing us to film him working in his workshop and participating in this programme. Today, Peebles is the 3rd largest town in the Borders and occupies both banks of the River Tweed. The surrounding road network enables people to travel easily to Edinburgh or elsewhere in the Borders. Though all the changes of recent years, Peebles still retains its historic layout and there is much to interest the visitor. It is known to be the best border town for its range and diversity of independent traders. And now back to the river. About 200 metres downstream from Tweed Bridge is another footbridge called Priorsford Bridge. It was built in 1905 from public subscription and Category B listed. It replaced an earlier bridge built in 1817 for Sir John Hay. The Tweed flows out of the town, more or less staying alongside the A72, and flows through open countryside towards the next location, Cardrona. This episode is perhaps a little bit different to the previous ones because there's been more history here and maybe less about the people and the geography of the river. I think, though, you will agree that this is a beautiful town set in some stunning surroundings. I've thoroughly enjoyed being here to film. As I said at the very beginning, that is what is really exciting about this new series, because each episode will deliver its own unique content as we unfold the remarkable story about this river. Well, that's it for this particular episode. If you've enjoyed it, then give it a like. subscribe if you haven't already done that. Don't forget to pass on the links to your friends and family. Encourage them to subscribe, because that all helps the channel. If you can possibly support the channel financially, then please make a donation using that blue link at the top of my homepage. But don't worry if you can't afford to do that. You can also support the channel, as I've said, by encouraging other people to watch the programs and subscribe, but also even watching the program right through to the end helps to promote the channel with YouTube. Anyway, I will, as the bells chime in the church tower there, I will say goodbye, wish you all the best and the very best of health until I see you a little bit further down the river in Cardrona in the next episode. But goodbye for now.